Welcome to this explainer. You know, if you look at Apple today, it is so easy to assume the iPhone was just this stroke of pure, unadulterated foresight. Like they just sat down one day and perfectly mapped out the future. But today, we're going to completely shatter that myth. Because as we dig into the sources, we uncover the true iPhone origin story. And honestly, it's incredibly chaotic. It was driven by internal desperation and was literally hanging by a thread for most of its development. So let's dive into it, because the real story is just so much more fascinating than the polished legend we all know. To immediately disrupt the idea that Steve Jobs always envisioned this app-heavy, super-powered pocket computer, we actually have to jump back to 2004. So his team presented him with a very first prototype of an internet-connected iPod, and Jobs notoriously just looked at it and said, "This is bullshit." Why? Well, his initial goal wasn't to build a revolutionary pocket computer at all. He just wanted to make a really cool phone that actually worked. According to developers, his absolute biggest pet peeve at the time was that his regular cell phone just kept dropping calls. For Jobs, the ultimate killer app was simply making a phone call, and he absolutely did not want any clunky software getting in the way of that one simple task. To really understand how Apple was practically forced into making a phone, we need to look at this timeline. Back in 2003, the iPod was a massive, unprecedented hit. We're talking 50% of Apple's total revenue. But behind closed doors, the executives were terrified. They realized that the exact second cell phone makers figured out how to cram a decent MP3 player into a mobile phone, the iPod was completely dead. So trying to protect their golden goose, they partnered up with Motorola in 2004 to create the Rocker. It was this iTunes-compatible phone meant to give people a little taste of iTunes without cannibalizing the iPod. But wow, the Rocker was an absolute disaster. It was clunky, it was slow, and Apple quickly realized they absolutely could not rely on third-party partners to protect their market share. Now, adding fuel to the fire with that whole Motorola flop was the balance of power in the telecom industry back then. Jobs actually went on the record saying, "The problem with a phone is that we're not very good going through orifices to get to the end users." And by orifices, which, let's be honest, is a wonderfully weird and gross choice of words, he meant the cell carriers, Verizon, AT&T, those guys. At the time, they held all the cards. They dictated exactly what phone hardware and software would look like, and Jobs absolutely despised giving them that kind of control. That failure of the Rocker made him realize that if Apple wanted this done right, they had to build the hardware themselves. This eventually led to a groundbreaking exclusive deal with AT&T that actually gave Apple total, unprecedented control over the iPhone's design. So the actual iPhone project officially gets greenlit under the codename Project Purple. And the level of secrecy here was borderline obsessive. Scott Forstall, who ended up running the software division, was explicitly told he couldn't hire a single person from outside Apple. So managers literally started knocking on doors inside their own headquarters, pulling top engineers aside and telling them they were being recruited for a top secret project. They couldn't say what it was, they couldn't say who they'd be working for, only that they were going to work harder than they ever had in their entire lives. Star engineers were just abruptly disappeared from other teams. They were locked down on a badge-restricted second floor that actually had a Fight Club sign on the door. Because, you guessed it, the first rule of Project Purple was you do not talk about Project Purple. And I gotta tell you, working on Project Purple was not some glamorous, fun tech startup vibe. Andy Grignon, a senior engineer on the project, famously referred to it as a soup of misery. The pressure was just unfathomable. These engineers were essentially told that the survival of the entire company rested on this one single device. So you've got this insane pressure cooker environment, an impossible mission, and a totally impossible deadline. People were working nights and weekends for over 2 years straight. It was so incredibly intense that several people involved later cited the iPhone project as the direct reason their marriages fell apart. They weren't just kicking their feet up making history. They were in a daily, desperate struggle to keep the whole program from collapsing. Because those stakes were so high, Apple didn't just put all their eggs in one basket. They actually held what was called the Great Bake-Off. This was a fierce internal war between two completely different competing concepts. So Track P1 was led by Tony Fadell's team, and their logic made total sense at the time. Take Apple's most successful product, the iPod, and just bolt a phone onto it, using that famous click wheel to navigate. On the other side, Track P2 was led by Scott Forstall's software team. They wanted to take a super experimental touch tablet research project and somehow shrink the massive Mac OS operating system to fit onto it. It became this brutal religious war inside the company. Do you go with the simpler, hardware-focused iPod phone or this crazy complex, software-heavy touch computer? And here's something wild. They came incredibly close to actually releasing that P1 iPod phone. The hardware team went all in. They were building the radio boards, they were locking down suppliers. They even successfully made real phone calls using this sort of steampunk-style rotary dial interface right on an iPod screen. They literally filed patents for it. And Jobs desperately wanted this to work because that technology was just so much closer to reality than the risky touchscreen. He pushed and pushed until it became painfully, laughably obvious to everyone that trying to dial a phone number or, God forbid, surf the web with an iPod click wheel was a remarkably terrible user experience. It just sucked. So the P1 track was finally killed off, but the radio system they built for it, that actually migrated right over into the final iPhone. Meanwhile, the P2 touchscreen team was over there making absolute magic out of pure frustration. The ultimate victory of the touch interface actually comes down to this really relatable, tiny detail. An engineer named Boz Ording was experimenting with touch interfaces, but he kept running into a problem. When he scrolled on the screen, he couldn't tell when he hit the top or the bottom of a document. He just kept thinking his program had frozen. So to fix this, he invented inertial scrolling. It's that famous rubber band effect that makes the screen kind of bounce back slightly when you reach the edge of a page. It was this tiny, incredibly tactile mathematical breakthrough that finally proved a flat glass screen could actually feel natural, alive, and responsive. And that rubber band effect? That was the exact aha moment for the entire company. When Boz Ording showed Steve Jobs that inertial scrolling working flawlessly on a prototype touch interface, Jobs was absolutely blown away. He reportedly looked at it and said, "My God, we can build a phone out of this." See, that touchscreen technology had actually been in development for an entirely different early tablet project. But seeing that bounce, Jobs immediately shelves the tablet. He instantly realized that this wildly experimental tech could be shrunk down to completely reinvent what a phone could be. But as always, proving a touchscreen worked in theory just wasn't enough. Jobs was getting really frustrated because the design team only had scattered fragments of ideas. A little piece of an address book over here, a tiny slice of a web browser over there. He wanted a cohesive narrative, a unified experience. And he flat out threatened to give the whole project to someone else if they couldn't deliver it immediately. This sparked what the team affectionately called the 2-week death march. Greg Christie's design team went to the mattresses. They worked sleepless, grueling, rapid-fire hours for 2 straight weeks just to map out that foundational user interface. This is the exact moment they hashed out the look of the home button, the media player, and all those iconic smartphone icons that would go on to define a solid decade of mobile design. Now, even with a beautiful touchscreen interface fully mapped out, there was still some dramatic, massive internal resistance. Remember, at the time, the BlackBerry was the undisputed king of smartphones, and everybody loved its physical, clicky keyboard. Well, Phil Schiller, who was Apple's head of marketing, was desperate to include a hard keyboard on the iPhone. And I mean, desperate. He literally brought a sword to every meeting, arguing that they couldn't possibly launch without one. I mean, just picture that. He pushed so incredibly hard, basically refusing to listen to reason, that Steve Jobs eventually just lost his temper. He threw Schiller completely out of a meeting, telling him to either get on the program or get out of the room. That explosive confrontation finally cemented the decision. There was no going back. The iPhone would be an all-glass touchscreen. But of course, brilliant software still needs a physical body to live in. And to make that 2007 launch even possible, Apple had to rely heavily on off-the-shelf technologies. It was a real scavenger hunt. They needed incredibly small but powerful lithium-ion batteries. They ended up using a 412 megahertz Samsung ARM11 chip. And crucially, in 2005, they reached out to Corning to find a glass that wouldn't get completely scratched up in your pocket like standard plastics did. Corning actually dug into their archives and resurrected some old, completely unused research material just to produce what we now know today as Gorilla Glass, specifically for this crazy new phone. Getting all that off-the-shelf hardware and brand new software to actually talk to each other, though, that required some serious, next-level ingenuity. What's absolutely fascinating is that despite Jobs constantly calling it a revolutionary mobile device, the original 2007 iPhone was, objectively speaking, incredibly underpowered. It had absolutely no GPU in the traditional sense, like no dedicated graphics hardware whatsoever. So how on earth did it achieve that buttery smooth scrolling that blew everyone away on stage? Well, it relied entirely on super clever software tricks. The engineers had to build a direct memory pathway, which is called a frame buffer, just to render the display. It was an absolute masterclass in software compensating for severe hardware limitations. To really put that into perspective, let's just contrast that frantic, underpowered 2007 reality with the devices we're all carrying around right now. According to hardware experts, modern devices like the iPhone 16 Pro Max have over 100 times more processing power than that very first 2G model. I mean, think about it. The first iPhone didn't even have an app store when it launched. Why? Because Jobs fundamentally didn't trust third-party developers not to write bad code that would crash the phone and, you guessed it, drop calls. Today, it is literally an AI-driven supercomputer in your pocket. It is just a staggering evolution for a device that started solely out of a paranoid fear of MP3 playing flip phones. Which brings us to the final thought of this explainer. The iPhone origin story proves it wasn't born from some crystal ball flawlessly predicting the future of mobile computing. Not at all. It was born from the very real threat of the Motorola Rocker, the embarrassing failure of the click-wheel iPod phone, a grueling soup of misery development cycle, and completely off-the-shelf hardware that was pushed to its absolute breaking point by brilliant software tricks. It really shows us that world-changing innovation almost never comes from perfect foresight. It comes from desperate, highly secretive, and wildly passionate problem solving. So next time you pull that magic glass rectangle out of your pocket, just remember the brilliant, chaotic mess that made it possible. Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep questioning the histories you think you know.